James Donovan's day started like any other. The towering lawyer, known for his calm yet commanding presence, had no idea his visit to the local orphanage would mark the beginning of an emotional journey he could never have predicted. The orphanage was quiet when James arrived. He had agreed to this visit as a favor to a colleague, nothing more than a brief appearance to maintain goodwill with the community. He wasn't one for sentimentalities. His world was wrapped in sharp suits, courtroom battles, and airtight contracts, not children's laughter and play. As James strolled through the front doors, the smell of freshly cleaned floors filled the air. A cheerful volunteer greeted him, guiding him into a small room where a few children were quietly playing. It was supposed to be a simple visit. Shake hands, smile, leave. But then, in the middle of the room, something unusual happened. A small girl, no more than 6 years old, broke away from the group. Her wide, curious eyes locked onto James, and before anyone could react, she dashed across the room, her little feet barely making a sound against the polished floor. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice fragile as she stood before him, clutching a worn-out photo in her small hands. James froze. The room seemed to tilt slightly as his brain tried to process what was happening. The girl was staring up at him with a mixture of awe and familiarity, as though she had known him her whole life. But James had never seen her before, not in his personal or professional circles. Yet, there was something unsettlingly familiar about her features. Her eyes, a light shade of hazel, much like his own. What did you say?" James stammered, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. The girl didn't respond with words. Instead, she thrust the photo she had been holding into his hands. James looked down at the worn image. His breath caught in his throat. There, in the photograph, stood a much younger version of himself, standing next to a woman he hadn't seen in years, Sophie, his former assistant, the woman who had disappeared from his life without a trace 7 years ago. But it was the sight of the little girl, younger but unmistakably the same, standing between them that shook him to his core. He felt his pulse race as confusion and panic began to set in. "How is this possible? Who gave this to you?" James asked, his voice now barely a whisper. His usual commanding presence was gone, replaced by uncertainty and fear. The girl blinked up at him, her face innocent yet somehow aware of the gravity of the moment. "Mommy said you were my daddy," she said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. "She said you would come." James felt the weight of her words crash down on him like a wave, threatening to drown him in a sea of emotions he wasn't prepared for. His mind raced. Sophie, his daughter? The orphanage volunteer, noticing the tension, approached hesitantly. "Is everything all right, Mr. Donovan?" she asked, glancing between James and the little girl, her concern evident. James struggled to find the right words, but none came. How could anything be all right when his entire world had just been upended by the revelation of a child? A child he never knew existed, now standing in front of him, calling him daddy. As the room seemed to close in around him, James realized this was only the beginning. He had no choice now but to uncover the truth. Why had Sophie disappeared? Why had she never told him about the child? And what in the world had happened in the 7 years since she vanished? But before any of those answers could come, he had to face the reality that this little girl, Ava, believed him to be her father. And in that moment, James Donovan's life, once so perfectly in control, spiraled into a chaos he never saw coming. James sat in his office, the photo of Sophie and Ava resting on the polished wooden desk before him. His fingers traced the edges of the picture absent-mindedly, his mind racing with questions. How had this happened? How had he gone 7 years without knowing he had a daughter? And where was Sophie? He couldn't shake the memory of Ava standing in front of him at the orphanage, her innocent eyes staring up at him as she whispered *Daddy. That single word had shattered the careful order of his life. Now, he was left with a deep, gnawing uncertainty. James exhaled slowly, his mind pulling him back to the last time he had seen Sophie. It was a quiet, rainy evening in New York. She had come to his office after hours, looking troubled, distracted even, but he hadn't pressed her. He had assumed it was another long day and a demanding job. Then, without warning, Sophie was gone. No goodbye, no resignation, just vanished. James had been angry back then, but life had swept him up in a wave of cases and deals, burying any feelings of betrayal under layers of work and success. But now, sitting here, everything from those years was coming back with crushing clarity. He had thought of Sophie sometimes, but never once had it crossed his mind that she might have left because of a child. Their child. A sharp knock on the door pulled James out of his thoughts. His assistant, Mary, poked her head inside. "Mr. Donovan, you have a meeting in 10 minutes, she reminded him. James barely acknowledged her. "Cancel it," he said abruptly, his voice hollow, "and clear my schedule for the rest of the day." Mary hesitated, surprised by the sudden command. "Is everything all right?" "No, it's not," he admitted, a rare vulnerability in his tone. "But just clear my schedule, please." As Mary left, James knew what he had to do. There was no way he could move forward without answers. The questions were swirling in his mind, but one thing stood out above all. Asterisk, where is Sophie? Asterisk. Picking up his phone, he called an old colleague, Frank, a private investigator he had worked with on more than one occasion. "Frank, I need you to find someone for me," James said without wasting time on pleasantries. "James Donovan, always straight to the point." Frank chuckled on the other end. "Who are we looking for?" "Sophie Brooks," James said, feeling the weight of her name on his tongue. "She worked for me years ago, then disappeared. I need to know everything you can find. Where she went, what she's been doing, and most importantly, where she is now." Frank paused on the other end, sensing the seriousness in James's voice. "Consider it done. I'll start digging right away." As he hung up the phone, James leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting back to the photograph. Ava's face, so much like his, haunted him. He had never wanted children. His career had always come first. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, something had shifted in him. He couldn't just walk away from this. He needed to understand why Sophie had kept Ava from him for all these years. He needed to know why she had disappeared so suddenly, without a word. The hours passed slowly, the usual hum of the office a distant blur as James waited for Frank's call. His mind cycled through memories of Sophie, her laugh, her quiet determination, the way she had always seemed so capable under pressure. What had happened that made her feel she had no choice but to leave? Finally, his phone buzzed. It was Frank. "I've got something," Frank said, his voice low. "But I'm not sure you're going to like it." James felt his stomach tighten. "What is it?" "Sophie didn't just disappear. She went into hiding," Frank said. "I found some traces, old rental agreements, credit card transactions. She's been keeping a low profile, using aliases. It's clear she didn't want to be found." James's breath caught in his throat. "Hiding from what?" "I'm still digging, but here's the kicker. About a year before she vanished, Sophie started making regular trips to a medical clinic. I checked into it, and it wasn't for herself. She was there for Ava. That's when she started pulling away. Whatever was going on, it had to do with the kid." James was silent, trying to absorb the information. Sophie had been hiding. For Ava? But from what? From who? "There's something else," Frank continued. "I traced her to a small town upstate. She's there, James. I have an address." James stood up abruptly, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Send it to me. I'm going." Frank hesitated. "Are you sure? If she's been hiding this long, she probably has a good reason. You might not like what you find." "I have to know, Frank. I need to see her. I need answers." James's voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. After Frank sent the address, James grabbed his coat and keys. He didn't bother telling anyone where he was going. This wasn't about work anymore. This was personal. As he sped down the highway towards the town where Sophie was hiding, James's thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and something he couldn't quite name. He wasn't prepared for this. He had spent his life controlling every aspect of his world. His career, his relationships, his future. But this was beyond his control. And deep down, he feared what he would find when he came face to face with Sophie again. What had driven her to such extreme measures? Why had she kept Ava from him? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. As James pushed the car faster towards the truth, James's car rolled to a stop on a quiet street in a small, unremarkable town upstate. The address Frank had given him led to a modest, two-story house with a weathered front porch and overgrown bushes that had clearly been neglected for some time. It didn't look like the kind of place where someone would choose to hide, but maybe that was the point. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house, his mind racing with questions. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the weight of the situation settled in. It had been 7 years since Sophie disappeared. 7 years since she walked out of his life without a word, leaving behind only memories, and now, the shocking revelation of Ava. The thought of Ava hit him hard again. His daughter, a little girl he had only just met, who had called him Daddy without hesitation. But the truth was, he wasn't ready to be anyone's father, especially not in a situation like this. And yet, here he was, about to confront the woman who had kept his child a secret from him for nearly a decade. With a deep breath, James stepped out of the car, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He walked towards the front door, each step heavier than the last, feeling as though the ground beneath him might give way. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt truly unsure of himself. He raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. What was he even going to say? How do you confront someone who has hidden such a life-altering truth from you? James exhaled sharply and knocked twice, his knuckles grazing the worn wood. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. He was about to knock again when he heard a soft shuffle from inside. Then, the door creaked open, and there she was. Sophie. She looked different, thinner, tired. Her once vibrant eyes now clouded with worry. Her hair, which used to be perfectly styled, was pulled back in a loose, messy bun, and her clothes were simple, almost too simple, as though she had been living in the shadows for too long. But there was no mistaking her. Even after all this time, she was still Sophie. Her eyes widened as she saw him standing there, the shock evident on her face. For a moment, they both stood frozen, the past 7 years crashing down between them like an invisible wall. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't know whether to be angry or relieved. There were so many things he wanted to say, but none of them seemed right. His throat felt tight as he spoke. "We need to talk." Sophie glanced behind her, almost nervously, before stepping out onto the porch and closing the door gently behind her. She didn't invite him in. That alone told him more than words could. "How did you find me?" she asked quietly, her eyes scanning the street as if she expected someone else to be watching. "I didn't come here to talk about how," James said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I came here because of Ava." At the mention of Ava's name, Sophie's expression shifted. Her hand went instinctively to the door behind her, as though she was trying to protect something. Or someone. "What about her?" she asked, but there was a tremor in her voice now. "She's my daughter," James said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "Why didn't you tell me, Sophie? Why did you keep her from me all these years?" Sophie's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked as if she might crumble right there in front of him. She leaned against the porch railing, rubbing her hands together nervously. "It's not that simple," she murmured, avoiding his gaze. "Not that simple?" James's frustration bubbled to the surface. "You disappeared, Sophie. You left without a word, and you never even gave me a chance to know about her. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time, James saw the raw emotion in them. There was pain there, but also something else, fear. "I did what I had to do to protect her," Sophie said, her voice shaking now. "It wasn't safe, James. It wasn't safe for either of us." "What do you mean, not safe?" he demanded, his mind spinning. "Sophie, what are you talking about? From who? From what?" She hesitated, biting her lip, as if she was weighing how much to tell him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she sighed deeply and looked him in the eye. "There were things going on that you didn't know about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things that were dangerous. After I left, after I found out I was pregnant with Ava, I had to disappear. I couldn't risk you finding us. I couldn't risk them finding us." James's brow furrowed. "Them? Who are you talking about, Sophie? Who was after you?" She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she clutched the railing. People from your past, James. People you don't even remember. Clients, enemies, whatever you want to call them. You were so focused on your cases, on winning, that you didn't see the danger that was circling around you. I couldn't let Ava be a part of that. James was stunned. He had spent years building his reputation, his career, always assuming that his victories in the courtroom had come without consequence. But now, hearing Sophie speak, it was like the ground beneath him was shifting. Could it really be true? Had his relentless pursuit of success put his family, his daughter, in danger? But why didn't you tell me? He asked again, his voice softer now, the anger fading. I could have protected you both. Sophie shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. No, James, you couldn't have. You didn't know what was happening. And by the time I realized how bad things were, it was too late. The only thing I could do was leave. James was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. His mind flashed through old memories, cases he had taken on, clients he had represented. Had he really been so blind to the dangers surrounding him? He felt a deep, gnawing guilt settle in his chest. So, what now? He asked finally, his voice low. Where do we go from here? Sophie wiped at her eyes, composing herself. I don't know, she admitted. But Ava, she deserves to know you. I can't keep her from you any longer. But you have to understand, James, there's still danger. I've kept her safe this long, but if we're going to do this, if you're going to be in her life, then you need to understand the risks. James nodded, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to walk away from Ava now that he knew she existed. I'll do whatever it takes, he said quietly, the determination clear in his voice. I'm not going to lose her. Sophie looked at him for a long moment, as if searching his face for something. Trust, perhaps. Then, with a shaky breath, she reached for the door behind her. Okay, she whispered, pushing it open. Come inside. We need to talk. James stepped inside Sophie's home, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The house was small, worn, and filled with a sense of quiet neglect. The furniture was simple, the walls bare, and the air smelled faintly of dust. It felt like a place meant to be temporary, as if Sophie had never intended to stay long. He noticed toys scattered across the floor in one corner. Small dolls, crayons, and a picture book with a torn cover. His heart tightened at the sight. Ava's world. A world he hadn't known about until now. Sophie closed the door behind him, and the faint click echoed in the stillness. She moved past him, her footsteps barely audible on the creaking wooden floor as she disappeared into the kitchen. James stood there for a moment, absorbing the gravity of it all. 7 years of silence. 7 years of Sophie hiding from something. Someone he had never seen coming. From the kitchen, Sophie called softly, Do you want coffee? Tea? Something stronger? Coffee's fine, James replied, his voice low, distracted. He walked slowly into the living room, his eyes catching on every little detail, as if each object might somehow hold a piece of the puzzle he was still trying to solve. Sophie reappeared with 2 mugs, placing them on the small, chipped coffee table in front of the couch. She sat down, pulling her legs up underneath her, curling into herself as if trying to make herself smaller, less exposed. James sat across from her, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't reach for the coffee. His mind was too busy processing everything she had told him. I don't know where to start, he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of his confusion. I don't even know what to ask first. Sophie stared down into her mug, her fingers wrapped tightly around it as if she were drawing warmth from it. I'll tell you everything, James, but you have to understand. I did what I thought was best. James nodded, though the frustration still lingered. I need to know, Sophie. Why now? After all these years, why tell me about Ava now? She exhaled slowly, then met his gaze, her eyes filled with regret. I always wanted to tell you. I hated keeping her from you, but I couldn't risk it. Not then. Not when it wasn't safe. But what changed? James pressed, his tone sharper than he intended. What made it safe enough to bring me into her life now? Sophie bit her lip, hesitating. It's not safe now either, she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. That's the thing, James. I don't know if it will ever be safe. James frowned. Then why? Because she needs you, Sophie interrupted, her voice firmer now. Ava needs her father. She deserves to know you. I've done my best to keep her safe, but it's not enough. It was selfish of me to keep you out of her life for so long. I see that now. James felt a strange mixture of anger and guilt rise inside him. He had been robbed of 7 years with his daughter, and yet here was Sophie, looking at him with such sadness, as if she carried the full weight of that decision on her own. He wanted to be furious, but seeing the fear in her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to lash out. Sophie, he said carefully, I need to understand what we're dealing with here. Who's after you? After Ava. Sophie's face tightened, and she set her mug down, folding her hands in her lap. It started years ago, while I was still working for you, she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just some threatening letters, weird phone calls. I thought it was nothing, maybe some disgruntled client. But then it escalated. I started seeing the same car parked outside my apartment, strange men following me home. It was terrifying. James's jaw clenched as she spoke. How had he not known about any of this? Had he really been so blind to what was happening under his nose? Sophie continued, I went to the police, but there was nothing they could do. They said without hard evidence, there wasn't much they could investigate. And then, I found out I was pregnant. That's when I knew I had to disappear. But who was behind it? James asked, his frustration building. What did they want? I don't know exactly who they were, Sophie admitted, her eyes filled with helplessness, but I'm certain it had to do with one of your clients. You were handling some big cases back then, criminal cases, corporate cases, people with dangerous connections. I think someone wanted leverage against you, and they thought I was the way to get it. James felt a cold chill settle over him. He had dealt with all kinds of clients in his career, but never had he considered that one of them might have posed a real threat to the people around him. He had always believed his work ended in the courtroom, that it was just business. But hearing Sophie's words made him realize how wrong he had been. I left because I couldn't risk them finding Ava, Sophie said, her voice breaking slightly. I thought if I disappeared, they'd stop looking. But I was wrong. They're still out there, James. Watching. Waiting. I don't know how much longer we can stay hidden. James's mind raced as he processed what she was telling him. His legal mind wanted to map out a strategy, to figure out who these people were, to take them down. But this wasn't just another case. This was his family, and it was personal. Why didn't you come to me sooner? He asked, his voice softer now. I could have helped. I would have protected you both. Sophie shook her head, her eyes filled with guilt. I was scared. I didn't know if you could. And honestly, I didn't know if you wanted to. We weren't together anymore, and I didn't think you'd want to be dragged into this. James opened his mouth to argue, but the truth of her words stopped him. They hadn't been together. Sophie had been his assistant, a colleague, and for a time, something more. But that had ended, and maybe, back then, she had been right to question whether he would have wanted this responsibility. But that didn't matter now. I'm here now, James said firmly, and I'm not leaving. Sophie looked at him, her expression softening just a little, as if some part of her wanted to believe him. I don't know what happens next, she admitted quietly. But if you're going to be a part of Ava's life, you need to understand the risks. They could come after us again, James. They could come after you. James leaned forward, his gaze steady. Let them come. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time since he had arrived, Sophie gave a small, fragile smile. Ava's upstairs, she said softly. She's probably coloring. She spends most of her time drawing. James stood, his heart pounding as he looked toward the narrow staircase that led to the second floor. His mind swirled with everything Sophie had told him. The danger, the fear, the years of hiding. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, he was about to meet his daughter. His daughter. As he climbed the stairs, each step seemed to carry a weight of its own. When he reached the top, he found a small bedroom door slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently and saw her. Ava was sitting on the floor, a pile of crayons scattered around her, completely absorbed in her drawing. Her dark hair fell over her face as she worked, and for a moment, James just watched her, his chest tightening with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Hi, Ava," he said softly. She looked up, her hazel eyes, so much like his own, meeting his. A small, shy smile spread across her face. "Hi, Daddy." The next few weeks passed in a surreal blur for James. He visited Ava as often as he could, trying to ease into a routine that felt both foreign and strangely natural. They spent afternoons in the park, evenings watching her favorite cartoons, and countless hours playing with her drawings and toys. Despite the uncertainty swirling around their lives, those moments gave James a rare sense of peace. But beneath that fragile calm, James knew danger still lurked. Sophie's warnings echoed in his mind, the weight of them growing heavier each day. She had been careful, always watching, always nervous. But now, with James back in their lives, the threat seemed more tangible, more real. One cold evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James was helping Ava pack up her crayons when Sophie's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her face immediately paled. She quickly silenced the call and shoved the phone into her pocket, but James caught the look in her eyes. Fear. "Sophie?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. "What's going on?" She shook her head, forcing a weak smile. "It's nothing," she lied, but James could see her hands trembling slightly. He stood up from the floor, crossing the room in a few strides, his gaze locked on hers. "It's not nothing," he said firmly. "Who was that?" Sophie bit her lip, hesitating before finally pulling the phone out of her pocket. She handed it to him without a word. James's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the screen. The caller ID showed only an unknown number, but the chill that ran down his spine told him all he needed to know. It wasn't just a random call. "Is it them?" James asked, his voice low, the anger he had been suppressing bubbling to the surface. Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with guilt. "They've been calling more often," she whispered, her voice shaky. "They haven't found us yet, but they're getting closer." James's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He couldn't believe they were still being hunted, that even after all these years, Sophie and Ava weren't safe. His daughter, their daughter, was living under the shadow of a threat that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with him. "We need to do something," James said, his voice hard. "We can't keep living like this." Sophie looked at him, her eyes pleading. "James, I've been doing everything I can to protect her. I don't know what else to do. We can't just hide forever." "Sophie," James snapped, frustration boiling over. "I'm not going to let them come after you and Ava. I need to stop this." Sophie flinched at the sharpness in his tone, but she nodded slowly. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window. "But these people, they're dangerous, James. They don't play by the rules. I don't know if you understand what you're up against." "I don't care," he said, his voice firm. "I'll protect both of you, whatever it takes." Before Sophie could respond, the faint sound of footsteps interrupted them. Ava appeared in the doorway, holding one of her stuffed animals, her innocent face peeking out from behind the toy. "Mommy? Daddy? Is everything okay?" she asked, her small voice filled with concern. James and Sophie exchanged a look, both of them silently agreeing to set aside the tension for Ava's sake. Sophie knelt down, her face softening as she reached out to her daughter. "Everything's fine, sweetie. We were just talking." Ava's eyes shifted between them, sensing the unease in the room. She held her stuffed bear a little tighter. "Are we going to be okay?" James's heart ached at the question, at the way such a small child had to carry the weight of their fears. He knelt beside Sophie, placing a reassuring hand on Ava's shoulder. "Yes," he said softly. "We're going to be okay." Ava's face brightened slightly, though James could see the doubt lingering behind her smile. He hated that this little girl, his daughter, was already learning to live with uncertainty and fear. Later that night, after Ava was tucked into bed and the house had fallen silent, James sat with Sophie in the living room, the tension between them thick. She had always been strong, capable, but tonight, she looked worn down, fragile in a way he hadn't seen before. "I can't do this alone anymore, James," Sophie finally admitted, her voice breaking. "I've tried to protect her, but I'm terrified every day. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his mind whirling. "We're not doing this alone," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I have resources, people who can help. We're going to figure out who's behind this, and we're going to put an end to it." Sophie looked at him, her expression filled with both hope and fear. "But what if they come after you, too? You have no idea who you're dealing with." James met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Then let them come," he said, his voice hard with resolve. "I've spent my life fighting battles in courtrooms. Now it's time to fight one outside of them." Sophie nodded, but her face remained tense. "Just promise me one thing, James," she said quietly. "No matter what happens, keep Ava safe. She's the only thing that matters." "I promise," James said, without hesitation. "I'll keep her safe, and I'll keep you safe too." The following week, the sense of looming danger intensified. James had hired Frank, his private investigator, to dig deeper into the threats. But something felt different now. The calls to Sophie's phone were increasing, the unknown number haunting them day and night. Whoever was behind it was getting closer, and they weren't hiding it anymore. One evening, James was heading back to Sophie's house after a late meeting when he noticed a black SUV trailing him. His instincts immediately kicked in. He wasn't paranoid, but something about the way the vehicle moved, staying just far enough behind to avoid suspicion, didn't feel right. James turned onto a quieter road, testing whether the SUV would follow. It did. His pulse quickened, but he kept his face calm. He glanced in the rearview mirror again. The SUV maintained its distance, but it was clear now it was following him. Reaching for his phone, James quickly dialed Frank's number. It rang twice before Frank picked up. "James, what's going on?" Frank asked, his voice laced with concern. "I'm being followed," James said, his voice clipped. "Black SUV. I'm heading towards Sophie's. I need to know who's behind this." Frank cursed under his breath. "Get off the road. Don't lead them to Sophie's house. I'll run a trace on that vehicle and call you back. In the meantime, stay sharp." James turned down a side street, his mind racing. He couldn't let them find Sophie or Ava. Not now. Not ever. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. James stared at it, his hand hovering over the screen. Every instinct told him not to answer, but he needed to know who was behind this. He answered. "Mr. Donovan," a cold, low voice said on the other end. "You've been very difficult to find." James's heart pounded in his chest. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled darkly. "That's not important. What matters is, I know who you are. I know who Sophie is. And I know where your daughter sleeps." James's blood ran cold. "Leave them alone," he growled through clenched teeth. "If you touch them, I swear I'll—" "Save your threats, Donovan," the voice interrupted. "You're in no position to make them. We'll be in touch soon. But if you care about that little girl of yours, you'll cooperate." The line went dead, and James slammed his fist against the steering wheel, rage and fear surging through him. He knew then, without a doubt, that the danger was no longer distant. It was here. James sat in his office, his head buried in his hands as the events of the past few days ran through his mind like a reel on repeat. The call, the chilling voice that had promised to come for Ava, played over and over again in his head. He hadn't told Sophie about the full extent of the threat. He couldn't. Not yet. Not until he had a plan. But it was eating him alive. Outside the window, the city lights blinked in the night, casting long shadows across his desk. Papers were scattered everywhere. Legal documents, files from old cases, and scribbled notes detailing every lead Frank had uncovered. But none of it mattered if he couldn't keep his family safe. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Frank. "James," Frank's voice came through the line, tight with urgency. "I traced the vehicle. It's linked to a known associate of Viktor Renko." James's blood ran cold at the name. Viktor Renko, an Eastern European crime lord James had crossed paths with years ago in a massive corporate fraud case. James had helped take down one of Renko's operations through a deal with a former client. He had known there might be repercussions, but he had never imagined they would come back to haunt him like this. "Renko?" James asked, his voice steady but filled with dread. "You're sure?" "Yeah, I'm sure," Frank replied. "Renko's men have been tracking you for weeks. It's no coincidence. He knows who Sophie is, and he's targeting her and Ava to get to you." James's mind spun. Renko had built a reputation for being ruthless, eliminating anyone who got in his way, leveraging every vulnerability. And now, James's greatest vulnerability was his daughter. "What do we do?" James asked, his voice betraying his fear. Frank hesitated before answering. "You're not going to like it. Renko's not the kind of guy you handle through legal channels, James. He operates outside the system, and if you want to protect Sophie and Ava, you need to be prepared to step outside it too." James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Frank's words settle deep in his chest. He had spent his entire career working within the system, believing that justice could always be found in the law. But now, facing someone like Renko, that belief felt fragile, almost naive. This wasn't just about legal maneuvering. This was about survival. "Tell me what we need to do," James said, his voice low, filled with resolve. "First, you need to go dark," Frank replied. "Move Sophie and Ava to a safe location, somewhere off the grid, where Renko can't find them. I've got a place in mind, but we need to move fast. Renko's already tightening the noose." James's mind raced. Going dark, disappearing. It was the very thing Sophie had been doing for years. But now, they had Ava. They couldn't live like this forever. They couldn't keep running. "I'll get them out," James said, determination lacing every word. "But this doesn't end with hiding. We need to end this, Frank. Renko has to be dealt with." "Agreed," Frank replied. "But let's get your family safe first. I'll send you the details of the location. You need to act tonight. Renko's men are already watching your movements." James hung up the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what had to be done, but that didn't make it any easier. He had fought countless battles in courtrooms, but this was a battle that went far beyond anything he'd ever faced. He grabbed his keys, shoving the legal documents into his briefcase, and headed out the door. There was no time to waste. Every minute they stayed put was another minute Renko's men could close in. When James arrived at Sophie's house, he found her sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. Ava was asleep upstairs, the house eerily quiet, as if the darkness had swallowed the usual warmth of their home. Sophie looked up when James walked in, her face pale and drawn. She had been like this for days. Tense, her eyes constantly flicking toward the windows, the fear palpable in every movement she made. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with worry. "You look different." James didn't sit down. He couldn't. His body was coiled with nervous energy, his mind racing with what needed to happen next. "We need to leave," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Now." Renko's men are closing in. Sophie's eyes widened, her face draining of color. "Renko?" she whispered. "He's here." James nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "He's coming for us. For Ava. We need to get out of here before they find us." Sophie stood up, panic flashing across her face. "Where will we go? We can't just leave everything behind." "Ava. She'll be safe," James interrupted, his voice firm. "I have a place. It's off the grid, secure. We'll be safe there until I can deal with Renko." Sophie hesitated, her mind clearly racing. She had spent years running, hiding, trying to keep Ava safe. But now, faced with the imminent danger, she knew there was no other choice. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's go." They moved quickly, packing only what they needed. James made sure to grab anything that would be hard to trace. Cash, unmarked phones, anything that could help them stay hidden. Sophie gathered Ava's favorite toys and clothes, her hands shaking as she stuffed them into a bag. Ava stirred slightly in her bed, but Sophie shushed her gently, trying to keep the little girl from waking into the nightmare unfolding around her. Within an hour, they were in the car, the weight of the situation pressing down on them as they sped through the dark, deserted streets. Sophie sat in the back seat with Ava, who was still groggy and confused, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. James could see Sophie's hand resting protectively on Ava's shoulder, her face pale in the dim light of the dashboard. "Where are we going?" Ava mumbled sleepily, rubbing her eyes. "Someplace safe, sweetheart," Sophie whispered, her voice soft but trembling. "We're going on a little trip, okay?" Ava nodded, too tired to question it further. She leaned against Sophie, her eyes fluttering closed again. James's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind working furiously as they drove further out of the city. He had to stay calm, stay focused, but the thought of Renko's men following them, hunting them, gnawed at him with every passing mile. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the safe house Frank had arranged. It was tucked away in the woods, far from prying eyes. The cabin was old, but sturdy, built to withstand isolation. There was no signal here, no modern conveniences, just a single, secure landline to keep in contact with Frank. James parked the car, and they quickly unloaded what little they had brought. Inside, the cabin was cold and dimly lit, but at least it felt safe. Ava was already half asleep again, her small body draped over Sophie's shoulder as they settled in. James looked around, taking in the bare, rustic surroundings. It wasn't much, but it was safe. "For now, we'll be okay here," he said, more to himself than to Sophie. Sophie set Ava down gently on one of the old couches, covering her with a blanket. She turned to James, her face weary but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being here, for not walking away." James nodded, the weight of his promise heavy in his chest. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." Sophie moved closer, her eyes searching his face. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice barely audible. James clenched his jaw, his mind already moving to the next step. "We wait," he said quietly, "and then we fight back." Sophie stared at him, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "And if Renko finds us?" James met her gaze, his expression hard. "He won't." But deep down, James knew the fight was only just beginning. Renko wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. And James wasn't just protecting a case or a client anymore. He was protecting his family, and he would stop at nothing to keep them safe. The morning light barely penetrated the thick woods surrounding the cabin, casting long shadows across the old wooden floor. The air was heavy with the stillness that comes after a storm, but inside, the tension was palpable. James hadn't slept. He sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the burner phone Frank had given him. His fingers tapped anxiously on the wood, waiting for the call that would tell him what their next move was. Sophie moved quietly through the cabin, her footsteps soft so as not to wake Ava, who was still sleeping soundly in the small bedroom. Despite the exhaustion etched into Sophie's face, her every movement was laced with vigilance, like someone who had been living on high alert for far too long. She poured a cup of coffee and brought it over to James, setting it in front of him without a word. He glanced up at her, their eyes meeting for a moment before she sat down across from him. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, and her skin looked pale in the morning light, but there was a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. They both knew that what came next would change everything, but neither of them could predict how. "Any word from Frank?" Sophie asked, breaking the silence. James shook his head, staring down at the coffee, its steam curling lazily into the air. "Not yet," he said, his voice rough from the sleepless night. "But it's only a matter of time before Renko makes his next move." Sophie rubbed her temples, the strain of constant fear wearing her down. "Do you really think we're safe here? For how long?" James looked at her, knowing she needed reassurance, but also knowing he couldn't offer it. "For now," he said softly, "but we can't stay hidden forever." Sophie nodded, her fingers playing nervously with the edge of the tablecloth. "I just want her to be safe." "James," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't keep running. Not with Ava. She's only 7. She shouldn't have to live like this." James's heart twisted at the raw emotion in Sophie's voice. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, his touch gentle but firm. "We're not running anymore," he said. "This ends now. Renko thinks he can keep us trapped, keep us afraid. But we're not going to let him take anything more from us. Sophie stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She wanted to believe him, but after years of looking over her shoulder, it was hard to trust that this nightmare could ever really end. Just then, the phone buzzed on the table, jolting them both. James grabbed it, his heart pounding in his chest as he answered. "Frank, it's me." Frank's voice crackled through the line, low and urgent. "I've got something." James motioned for Sophie to sit closer, putting the phone on speaker. "Go ahead," he said, his voice tense. "I dug deeper into Renko's network," Frank began, "and I found a lead, a weak link in his operation. One of his lieutenants, a guy named Oleg, has been getting sloppy. There's been talk that he's not as loyal to Renko as he lets on. Word is, he's got his own agenda, and Renko's starting to question his loyalty." James's brow furrowed. "Oleg? How does this help us?" "Because he's the one overseeing the men who've been tailing you and Sophie," Frank explained. "If we can get to him, we might be able to use him to get to Renko, or at least disrupt Renko's plans enough to buy you more time." Sophie leaned in, her eyes wide. "How do we get to him?" Frank hesitated for a moment before answering. "He's scheduled to meet with one of Renko's contacts tomorrow night at a warehouse near the docks. It's off the radar, no official records of the meeting. If you're careful, you can get to Oleg before anyone knows you're there." James clenched his jaw, his mind already turning over the plan. It was risky, too risky, if he was honest with himself. But what choice did they have? Sitting here in the cabin, waiting for Renko to make the next move, wasn't an option. He wasn't going to wait for danger to find them. "All right," James said, his voice hard with resolve. "I'll go." Sophie's eyes widened in alarm. "No, you can't just walk into something like this, James. What if it's a trap?" James met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "I don't have a choice, Sophie. If we don't take the fight to Renko, he'll keep coming. We have to stop him before he gets to Ava." Sophie's lips trembled, her fear for him evident. "But if something happens to you..." "Nothing will happen to me," James said, his voice gentler now, though the tension was still there. "I'll be careful. Frank will be there, too. We'll handle it." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, clearly struggling to hold herself together. She had been strong for so long, but now, faced with the possibility of losing James, of Ava losing her father, her strength seemed to falter. James reached for her hand again, his grip firm but reassuring. "I'll come back," he promised. "I'm not going to leave you and Ava." Sophie squeezed his hand, nodding even though doubt lingered in her eyes. She knew the stakes, and so did James. But he couldn't sit back and do nothing. Frank's voice broke the silence. "I'll send you the details for tomorrow night. Be ready." James hung up the phone, and for a moment, neither he nor Sophie spoke. The reality of what was coming weighed heavily between them. James knew that this meeting with Oleg could be the turning point, but it could also be the beginning of something far more dangerous. The next night came too quickly. James stood by the window of the cabin, staring out into the darkness as he prepared for what lay ahead. Frank had sent him the coordinates, the time, and the layout of the warehouse. Everything was set. But despite the meticulous planning, James felt a knot of anxiety twisting in his gut. This wasn't the courtroom. This was real, raw, dangerous. Sophie stood behind him, watching him with quiet intensity. She had tried to talk him out of going one last time, but James was resolute. They couldn't run forever, and he wasn't about to let Renko win. Not when Ava's future was on the line. "I'll be back before sunrise," he said, turning to face her. "Just stay here with Ava. Don't open the door for anyone but me or Frank." Sophie nodded, though her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Be careful," she whispered. James stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I will." Before she could say anything else, he leaned down and kissed her, soft, slow, but filled with a silent promise that he would come back to her, no matter what. Then he left. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its rusted exterior blending into the shadows of the docks. The air was thick with the smell of salt and oil, the night alive with the distant hum of the city. James stood in the darkness, Frank beside him, both men hidden from view. "This is it," Frank whispered. "Olek's inside, along with a couple of Renko's men. We wait until the deal's about to go down, then we move in." James nodded, his body tense, every muscle coiled and ready for action. His mind was focused, clear. He wasn't a lawyer tonight. He wasn't arguing a case. He was a father, fighting for his daughter's life. As they moved closer to the warehouse, James could hear voices inside. Low, murmured conversations, the sound of footsteps echoing off the concrete floors. His heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve never wavered. This had to end tonight. For Sophie, for Ava, for all of them. He took a deep breath, ready to confront whatever lay ahead. The warehouse loomed larger as James and Frank moved closer, the cold night air thick with tension. The distant sounds of the city had faded, leaving only the low hum of machinery and the occasional clatter of metal echoing from inside the building. James crouched low behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, his pulse steady but his mind racing. Everything had led to this moment, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Frank peered around the edge of the container, his face hard with concentration. "We've got 2 guards at the entrance," he whispered, motioning with his hand. "Olek should be inside, along with Renko's other men. The deal's going down in the next few minutes. We move in fast. Take Olek out before anyone notices." James nodded, his body tense, every muscle ready to spring into action. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained for this kind of thing, but he knew how to read people, how to anticipate their moves, and right now, that was all he had to rely on. That, and the unshakable need to protect Sophie and Ava. "This is our shot, James," Frank added, his voice grim. "We take Olek, and we get him to talk. If we pull this off, Renko will lose his leverage, and we'll be able to protect your family." James clenched his fists, his mind replaying the voice on the phone, the cold threat that had promised harm to Ava. He had to end this. There was no room for hesitation. "Let's go," James said, his voice low but firm. Frank gave a quick nod, and they moved. Silently, they approached the warehouse entrance, sticking to the shadows. The guards stood near the door, oblivious to the threat creeping toward them. Frank signaled James, and without a word, they both sprang into action. Frank moved swiftly, taking down the first guard with a quick strike to the back of his neck. The man crumpled silently to the ground. James, heart pounding, grabbed the second guard from behind, his arm tightening around the man's throat until he went limp. For a moment, everything was still, their breaths shallow, the night holding its breath alongside them. "Clear," Frank whispered. James nodded, his mind laser-focused. They dragged the guards behind a stack of crates, making sure they were hidden from view. Then, they slipped through the entrance, the warehouse door groaning softly as it opened. Inside, the warehouse was vast and dimly lit, the air filled with the smell of oil and metal. Stacks of boxes and pallets lined the walls, creating narrow pathways that twisted through the space like a maze. In the center of the warehouse, under a single hanging light, stood Olek. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a thick beard. His back was to them, but James could see the way he carried himself, casually confident, as if he had nothing to fear. 2 other men stood nearby, their hands resting on their guns as they waited for the deal to begin. Frank motioned for James to stay low, and they moved silently through the shadows, positioning themselves just a few feet from where Olek and his men stood. "Wait for my signal," Frank whispered, his eyes locked on Olek. "We take him alive, and we get him to talk." James's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him. He hadn't wanted it to come to this, violence, danger, but there was no other way. Not anymore. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the air, shattering the silence. "Where is it?" One of Renko's men barked, his voice thick with impatience. "You said the shipment would be here by now." Olek turned, his face calm but dangerous. "It'll be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Renko doesn't like delays, but he knows this deal is worth waiting for." James's muscles tensed as he watched the exchange. This was it. They had to move now, before the deal went down, before Renko's men had the upper hand. Frank met James's eyes, giving him a quick nod. The signal. They both sprang from the shadows, moving with precision. Frank grabbed one of the men, slamming him into the nearest stack of crates, while James lunged at Oleg, his fist connecting with the man's jaw. Oleg staggered back, caught off guard, but recovered quickly, his face twisting into a snarl. "Who the hell are you?" Oleg growled, wiping the blood from his lip. James didn't answer. He moved in again, his movements swift and purposeful, landing another punch before Oleg could react. But Oleg was strong, and in an instant, he was on the offensive, shoving James back with a powerful strike to his chest. James stumbled but didn't fall, his adrenaline pushing him forward. "I know who you are," Oleg sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You're Donovan, the lawyer. Renko's been looking for you." James gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "Then you know why I'm here." Oleg laughed, a dark, humorless sound. "You think you can stop Renko? You're a fool. He's untouchable." "I don't need to stop Renko," James said, his voice low and steady. "I just need to stop you." Before Oleg could respond, Frank appeared behind him, pressing a gun to the back of Oleg's head. "You're coming with us," Frank growled, his voice ice-cold. Oleg froze, his bravado faltering for the first time. He glanced at the men he had come with. One was unconscious, the other struggling to get to his feet. But he knew he was outmatched. "You're making a mistake," Oleg hissed, his eyes darting between James and Frank. "Renko will never let you win. He'll come after you. He'll come after your family." James stepped closer, his face inches from Oleg's. "Let him," he said, his voice like steel. "But first, you're going to tell us everything you know." Frank moved quickly, securing Oleg's hands with zip ties before shoving him forward. They needed to get him out of there, fast, before anyone else showed up. But as they moved toward the exit, something in the air shifted. A noise, faint but unmistakable, came from outside the warehouse. Footsteps, more than one pair. James's heart dropped. They weren't alone. "Frank," James hissed, his voice filled with urgency. Frank's face hardened. "Get down. Now." They ducked behind a stack of crates just as the warehouse door burst open, a flood of armed men pouring in. James's pulse skyrocketed as he counted at least 5, maybe more, all of them armed to the teeth. Renko's men had arrived. James clenched his fists, his mind racing. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped inside a warehouse with no clear way out. He glanced at Frank, who was already calculating their next move, but the odds were not in their favor. The lead man, tall and dressed in black, barked orders to the others. "Find them, and don't let anyone leave alive." James's heart pounded in his chest. He had come here to end this, but now it seemed like the end was coming for him instead. He had promised Sophie he would come back. He couldn't break that promise. Not now. Not ever. The shadows closed in around them as the men searched the warehouse, their footsteps growing louder, closer. James could feel the danger pressing in, suffocating. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going down without a fight. Not tonight. Not while Sophie and Ava were still waiting for him. He glanced at Frank, who gave a sharp nod. They weren't finished yet. This fight was just beginning. The warehouse was a cold, silent labyrinth of shadows as James crouched behind a stack of crates, his heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in the quiet. Renko's men were moving methodically through the space, their boots crunching on the dusty concrete floor as they hunted for him and Frank. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, the danger closing in from all sides. James tightened his grip on the gun Frank had handed him earlier. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what was at stake. Sophie, Ava, their lives hung in the balance, and if he failed tonight, the consequences would be unthinkable. He couldn't let Renko's men find him, not before he got the information they needed from Oleg. Frank was crouched beside him, his face set in a grim, determined mask. They were trapped, outnumbered, and every possible escape seemed to be closing off. But they still had Oleg, who was bound and gagged a few feet away, his eyes wild with fear now that he realized Renko's men might just as easily eliminate him for failing to handle the situation. "They're splitting up," Frank whispered, his voice low but steady. We have to move now before they pin us down. James nodded, swallowing hard. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about ending it, for good. He could see it in Frank's eyes too. They were going to fight their way out or die trying. Take the left side, Frank instructed, his gaze sharp as he peered around the crates. I'll draw their attention. You get Oleg out. James's heart raced. And then what? We can't outrun them forever. We won't need to, Frank said, a flicker of something close to a smile touching his lips. I've got backup on the way. Renko's men won't see it coming. James clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. He trusted Frank, but the idea of backup arriving in time felt like a long shot. Still, it was the only shot they had. He looked over at Oleg, who was trying and failing not to look terrified. You make sure he talks, Frank added, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. We can't leave here without knowing where Renko is or how to take him down. James gave a single, determined nod. I'll handle it. With that, Frank slipped out from behind the crates, his movements smooth and deliberate. He stayed low, skirting the shadows as he worked his way toward the opposite end of the warehouse. James watched him go, then turned his attention to Oleg. Oleg's eyes were wide, his face pale as James approached. He could tell the man was calculating his chances of surviving the night, and they weren't looking good. James crouched down beside him, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him closer. We're getting out of here, James whispered, his voice cold and deadly serious. But if you want to live, you're going to tell me everything I need to know. Where's Renko? What's his next move? Oleg's breathing was ragged, and James could see the fear in his eyes. For a moment, it looked like Oleg might hold out, refuse to speak. But then, the reality of the situation seemed to sink in. The men Renko had sent weren't here to save him. They were here to clean up a mess, and Oleg knew it. They're going to kill me, Oleg hissed, his voice trembling with desperation. Renko, he's already planning to get rid of me. You think I don't know that? Then help me stop him, James urged, tightening his grip. You give me what I need, and I'll make sure you stay alive. Oleg hesitated, his gaze flicking between James and the shadows where Renko's men were still searching. Finally, he nodded, his voice low and shaky. Renko's hiding in the old port district, in a warehouse near the river. He's been planning this for weeks. He wants to take you out, your family, everyone tied to you. James's stomach turned at the mention of Sophie and Ava, but he kept his face neutral. How many men does he have? Dozens, Oleg replied, his eyes darting nervously. But they're stretched thin right now. He's overconfident. He doesn't think anyone's coming for him. James's mind raced, piecing together the information. This was the break they needed. If Renko was vulnerable, this was the moment to strike. But they had to get out of here first. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the far side of the warehouse, sharp and violent. Frank had made his move, drawing Renko's men into a firefight. The sounds echoed through the building, sending a jolt of adrenaline through James. This was it, time to move. James yanked Oleg to his feet, keeping the gun pressed against his back as they navigated through the maze of crates and boxes. He kept low, his senses on high alert, every nerve buzzing with tension. The sound of footsteps and shouts ricocheted around them as Renko's men spread out, but James stayed focused. They were close to the exit. Just as they reached the door, two of Renko's men appeared from around a corner, their guns raised. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down. James's instincts kicked in, and he fired first, the shot echoing in the cavernous space. One of the men dropped, and before the other could react, James fired again, taking him down. Oleg stumbled, his breath ragged as James pushed him toward the door. Keep moving, James ordered, his voice sharp. They burst through the warehouse door and into the cold night air. James scanned the area, his heart racing as he looked for any sign of more of Renko's men. But the streets were eerily quiet, and for a brief moment, James thought they might have made it out. Then, the unmistakable roar of an engine filled the air. A black SUV screeched around the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beacons of death. James shoved Oleg behind a stack of barrels, his mind racing as the vehicle barreled toward them. But before the SUV could reach them, a blast of gunfire erupted from the opposite side of the street. Frank's backup had arrived. A second SUV appeared, its windows down as Frank's team unleashed a hail of bullets on Renko's men. The black SUV veered off course, slamming into a row of parked cars before coming to a screeching halt. James didn't wait to see what happened next. He grabbed Oleg and sprinted toward the waiting vehicle where Frank's team was stationed. Frank emerged from the shadows, his face grim but determined. "You get what we need?" James nodded, shoving Oleg toward him. "Renko's at the Old Port District. He's vulnerable, but we need to move fast." Frank's eyes gleamed with cold satisfaction. "Good. Let's end this." 3 days later, it was over. Renko had been arrested in a coordinated raid on the Port District warehouse. The police had stormed the compound in the early hours of the morning, catching him and his men completely off guard. The man who had spent years building an empire of fear and violence was finally in custody, his criminal network shattered. James stood in front of the window of his office, staring out at the city below. The weight of everything he had been through still clung to him, but there was a new sense of relief, a lightness that he hadn't felt in years. Renko was gone. The danger to Sophie and Ava was over. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Sophie standing there, holding Ava's hand. Ava smiled up at him, her eyes bright and full of life, so different from the fear that had once clouded them. "Daddy," she said, running to him and wrapping her arms around his legs. "Are we really safe now?" James knelt down, pulling her into a hug, his voice soft but filled with certainty. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe now." Sophie approached slowly, her eyes filled with the same relief he felt. She smiled, though there was still a hint of disbelief in her expression. "It's over." James nodded, standing and taking her hand. "It's over." For the first time in what felt like forever, James allowed himself to breathe. They had come through the fire, and now there was only the future ahead of them. Together. "Let's go home," Sophie whispered, and for the first time in years, the word home felt real. James nodded, his heart full as he led his family out of the office, into the sunlight, and toward the life they were finally free to live.